This morning, we're going to continue in our discussion of the issue of trust. In God, we trust. I love the picture of those guys. Because do you ever feel that way? You ever feel like that way as you're walking the faith life? There are times when you don't really know what your next step is, and we're all in this thing together. And yet it is a life of trust. It's a life of depending on God to do and to be what He said He would do. A few weeks ago, as we were in the early stages of this series, I mentioned a picture to you of our daughter, Courtney, from when she was little. And we've gone back into the archives, and we have been able to get this in digital form for you. That's when we were living in Oakdale, and Courtney's what, 2?
Yeah, not quite.
She's about 2. Can you all see that okay? Who's the skinny guy? Yeah, you had to say that, huh? Yeah, I'm a mirror image of my former self. I told you Courtney would sit on top of the refrigerator, and then she would slide off. I showed this to some workers at hospice the other day, and they said the picture on the left, she looks like she's got some obvious misgivings about this whole process, that she's not too sure about it all, and so we're getting ready to have some fun. And then, of course, she slides off the refrigerator, and I absolutely love that picture of her in my arms. I didn't remember all the curly hair she had. She obviously didn't get it from me. And you look at that, and what are some observations you make of this picture on the right? Joy, okay. Trust. Happiness. Yeah, she's having a good time, huh? Yeah. Relief. Yeah, there's some. Yeah, he did catch me. Yeah. I also thought it was interesting. She knew where the camera was. But the thing that obviously stands out most of all is look at the smile. Look at the smile. I mean, consider all of the elements of this process, okay? Consider the fact that she's sitting on a unit that's probably at least twice as tall as she is, if not more than that. And so you can understand some of the trepidation that she would have. So even though she knows I'm there, and even though she knows that she can trust me, or she's come to trust me, yet there's still a little bit of uncertainty about all of this. And yet you look at the joy that's on her face in that. And you know what else? We did it more than once. It became something that we did, and it was fun. And she got to where she enjoyed doing that with me. And that's, I think that's an important thing for us to realize, is that she, even though we can identify all of the uncomfortable elements to this, she was having a good time. She was having a really good time. Now, an interesting thing happened. A time came when she didn't want to do that anymore. She became too big physically. The probability of Dad dropping her became much greater. But she became too big emotionally. It would have been an embarrassing moment for her. How many of you have ever had a junior higher say, "Oh, Dad," "Oh, Mom," it's just what happens. And frankly, if we were able to pull this off when she was older, it wouldn't be a picture we would be showing you because you would be having some serious doubts about us, about how legitimate our sanity is. But she also became too big intellectually. Realizing the risk, she might not have been ready to do that. How many of you have gone back and tried to reenact things that you did when you were younger, and you look at that and you think, "Oh my gosh, we did that?" And you get to the point where you think, "Oh, I don't know if I'm up to doing that or not." And so our minds get in the way of our being able to do that, which brings me to our conversation for today. Can you see the points that I'm making here? She becomes too big intellectually. She becomes too big emotionally. Any of us ever get too big intellectually? Any of us ever get too big emotionally? And I think sometimes we get too big physically. We get too big physically because we think, well, I'm old enough, I should be over that. Or I should manage that. Or I shouldn't have to do that. One of the enduring and endearing qualities of children is their willingness to trust. Children, Larry, thank you for the song that you sang, because in that is that simplicity of a child's trust. Courtney's illustration is a perfect example of that kind of trust, but I want you to think with me a little bit longer this morning. What are some of the other examples that we might be able to pull up of things that children believe because they're so trusting? Santa Claus is a first example. Frosty the Snowman. Yeah, there's this big, fat, white bearded guy who will drop down your chimney and leave gifts. And I mean, they buy it. They buy it. Frosty the Snowman. Who else? What else? Yes. Yes. And he's close. He's close. The Tooth Fairy is another great example. The Easter Bunny, that's right. All of those things. I mean, when you consider the ridiculousness of those things that kids believe, and the trauma that some kids have when somebody tells them that they're not true too soon. You know, it really becomes an emotionally challenging thing for kids. Children are told many other exaggerations, unfortunately, that they believe. Your parents don't love you. Or a parent to a child, I don't love you. Or people who lie to children to cover up abusive situations and say, if you tell somebody, I will kill your family. And kids believe that. Kids believe it. You're stupid. I met with a patient recently who told me that her mother said these words to her. If abortion had been legal when you were born, I would have aborted you. This is an older woman who today still has trouble trusting her parents. You can understand why. Kids believe. So why are they so willing to trust? Some have supposed it's their innocence or naivety. Some have supposed it's a lack of experience with dishonesty, that they grow up in home situations where someone says we're going to have dinner at 5 o'clock and they have dinner at 5 o'clock. Or we're going to take care of the needs that you have, and those needs are handled. And so the child learns, as they get older, they learn to trust, but even earlier, before the child has a need to be fed and mom nurses the child. I mean, there is this bond of trust that is built up, and so they haven't had any experience with dishonesty. Some have supposed that it's brain development, that their brains have not fully developed yet, and that they just don't see the danger in things, and so they're willing to trust regardless of what the other person said. I did a little research yesterday, and there's a researcher from the University of Virginia who has studied the inclination of children to be trusting. And he asked the question, why is it that children do trust others? And one of the questions he posed I thought was very interesting. He said, why would a child listen to someone say that an eel is a fish and not believe that it's a snake? Because an eel certainly doesn't look like any fish that we normally catch, and yet that's its zoological classification. His research with 3-year-olds indicated that they aren't just trusting. I want you to listen to this. This is really a powerful thing. It's not that they're just trusting of anyone and anybody in any situation. He said they are especially trusting of what people say to them. It is a verbal communication that they have a tendency to trust. Now, he focused his research on 3-year-olds, and so certainly there's some limiting of the findings there. But I thought it was interesting that they were willing to trust what people said to them. Has anybody, do you remember when you were a kid, somebody telling you something that, as you look back on it now as an adult, was just ridiculous, but you believed them? You're making me feel very uncomfortable because not many of you are nodding. I think we've all had that situation. I think I've told you before, one Christmas, my brother told my sister that if she would tell him what he was getting for Christmas, he would tell her what she was getting for Christmas. Well, she was about 3. And she just blurted right out what my brother was getting for Christmas. And my mom was just fit to be tied. She was so frustrated. But that was, my sister believed what my brother had to say. The predisposition to trust, just as a side comment here, makes it so important for us to teach children early in life the stories and the truths of God's Word. That we embed those in their thinking, that we embed those in their hearts, whether they're your children or your grandchildren, that you do everything. It is so important. It's why we have special programs for our children here. It's why we have Children's Church that Pastor Steve oversees so well. The nursery program that Kathy and others provide leadership for. It's why we do that. And you might want to know, we are working right now on additions to those ministries to retool and redo their rooms to make them more inviting and interesting for the children and the nursery, because we value that. That is a critical part of the spiritual growth of an individual. As a matter of fact, studies show that if a child does not make a decision for Christ by the time they reach 18, it's likely that they won't until way later in their lives. Okay, it's just a critical time in their lives. We implant God's Word in them while they are impressionable and sensitive to its message. But something happens along the way to our becoming adults. Trust is one of the most, if not the most difficult quality for us to maintain. And I don't mean just spiritually. I'm talking about across the board, life in general, trusting people. Somebody knocks on your door during the dinner hour in the evening. What's your thought as you walk to the door? Who is selling what? Who is selling what that I don't want? Okay, there are, and why do we have those trust issues? Well, because we've had a lot of situations where people come to the door, they interrupt our evening with something that we don't want. Or if the phone rings and we get a marketing call, we don't trust the fact that people are going to call us for reasons that we would be interested in. All of us have been bitten by the specter of broken trust. We have been bitten by that. Someone failed to fulfill an obligation that you were counting on. You needed them. They said they were going to come through for you, and they didn't. And you were left holding the bag. You were embarrassed, or you were forced to pay for something that really wasn't yours to pay for. Or someone misrepresented a product. Someone didn't keep their word. It's why we have legal contracts, because people break trust. It's why we have legislation, so that we can protect people from those who aren't faithful to their word. It's why we have judges. We're all suspicious and wary of claims that others make, whether it's corporations, businesses, or individuals. Listen to a few quotes. Listen to this first one carefully. Maya Angelou said, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." Anybody ever misrepresented themselves to you the first time? And you believe them? And then you believe them again? Charles Schultz, "I love mankind. It's people I can't stand." The author, John Steinbeck, "Maybe everybody in the whole world is just scared of each other." There's more truth to that than I think we want to realize too. Broken trust is at the core of the fall. When we go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, broken trust is at the core of what happened in the fall. Think of these examples with me. Satan broke trust with God when he wanted to take God's place. God who had created Satan, God who had gifted Satan, God who had put Satan in a significant place in his kingdom. Some theologians think that Satan was the worship leader of heaven, and that all of the worship would somehow flow through him, and that as he heard all of that, his heart was lifted up and he wanted to become the focus of worship, and that's why he wanted to take God's place. So the first breach of trust was Satan with God. The second breach of trust was Eve with God. She listened to the serpent and she broke trust with God. This third one is interesting. Eve broke trust with Adam. Think about it for a minute. She was willing to throw their relationship away. How could Eve and Adam have existed, could they have coexisted with her having identified with Satan and Adam still being in the innocent state of sinlessness? What kind of relationship would there have been between them? And yet she was willing to throw that away in order for her to get the enticing things that Satan was offering to her. The fourth, Eve with Adam. The fifth, Adam with God. Think about this a minute. Adam preferred his relationship with Eve more than he preferred his relationship with God. Think about that a minute. He chose Eve over God. That's a pretty serious breach of trust, isn't it? And then lastly, Adam with Eve, because when God came to hold him accountable, Adam said, "Well, you know, it was that woman that you gave me. I mean, this is really all her fault. My hands are clean, God. She actually held the apple. I just bit it." No, not hardly. And suspicion and lack of trust have reigned in our world ever since, in varying degrees, in varying stages. And yet, relationships will not survive without it. Relationships will not survive without trust. God has devoted himself to proving to us that he is trustworthy. He has devoted himself to that process. Even in the judgment that he pronounced after the fall, he showed himself trustworthy. Because he had told them, if you do this, you will die. And he began the process in them. Even in the judgment that he passed, God was trustworthy. The premise of the whole series that we're doing here is the desire in God's heart to regain our trust, that we would be trusting people to Him, not because He isn't trustworthy, but because you and I are so traumatized by the fall that we won't trust Him. Remember the video that we saw, the first one, where the girl was falling back into the arms of the guy who was portraying God's role? And her final comment to him was, "It's not that I don't want to try, it's that I won't do it. I won't do it." And whether it's people who won't come to faith in God and who won't open their hearts and receive His forgiveness, or you and I who choose to live life more on our own terms rather than on God's terms, it's an issue of I won't. And I will do things in a way that I'm comfortable with. And it isn't always just this stomping my foot and saying, "No, God, I will not do that." Sometimes we're just afraid. Sometimes the fear of what God is wanting us to do, or what we feel like is the next step for us, the fear is so great, and we can't trust that God will somehow catch us, and that He will be with us, and that if He is calling us and moving us to do that, then He is the one who's going to come alongside us and enable us to accomplish it. Isn't it interesting that God never intended for Israel to part the Red Sea on their own? As a matter of fact, when He talked to Moses initially about going back to Egypt and leading the people of Israel, what's the question God asked Moses when he was standing at the burning bush? "What's in your hand, Moses?" He didn't even ask Moses to go do anything special. He said, "Moses, what's in your hand?" Because, folks, for us, God has already put in our hands what He wants to do through us to enable us if we will trust Him. And everything He is doing in our lives is to bring us to that place. Yet we get a picture of what it can be like to trust when we see a child in its innocence trust those who sometimes are not trustworthy. We've seen that. Children who trust people who aren't worthy of it. How about the child that keeps going back to a parent that has failed them time and time and time and time again? How about the spouse that goes back to a husband or a wife? It could be either way. How about the spouse that goes back and keeps going back only to be disappointed again, and goes back again only to be disappointed? We've seen that trust in play, and we see that it can happen. Here's the thing that I think is so powerful when we look at the research about the 3-year-olds, that God has wired us to trust. He has wired us to trust. Where does the breakdown come? In many places, for different places for different people. But God has wired us to trust. If we weren't wired that way, no one would be getting married. If we weren't wired that way, business partners would not go into business with one another. If we weren't wired that way, no one would honor stop signs. Well, that may be a bad example. No. If we weren't wired that way, there would be utter chaos in all of society. Because we are predicated on trust. And so the issue then becomes, how do we learn to trust God in the way that He would like for us to? I think it's amazing to us that John wrote these words describing Jesus. Now remember, what is it that 3-year-olds were inclined to believe? What they heard, what someone spoke to them. what someone said to them, right? Listen to this. John writes it in the opening chapter of his gospel. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, that we might, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Isn't it interesting that we who are wired to believe the words that someone has spoken to us, that it was the living Word that God sent to us to reveal the true nature of who God is, and what is it that he comes to speak to us? He comes to speak words of grace and words of truth. I've been waiting to come to this place this morning because as I wrote yesterday, there was such a powerful sense of God's presence in that wonderfully spiritual place called Starbucks. And God began to speak about these words of grace and truth. And I want you to listen. I believe that God intends this as a prophetic word for us today. Jesus came as the expression of all the Father wants to say to us. Words of grace. Words like this: I love you. I will never leave you or forsake you. I am here to bless you, to give you a hope and a future. I am here to roll back the rejection and the disapproval others have placed on you and to replace it with my favor. And then he says they are words of truth to show you who I really am and not who you feared me to be. To show you whom I've made you to be and to remove the stigmas imposed on you by others. To make the path of understanding my way clear and to lead you into it. But it's predicated on our trust. Will we trust? How many of you here this morning have had people say things over you? They've put stigma on your life. They've said you'll never be this or you'll never be that. Or they have angrily accused you of being this or that. And you've lived with the fear that no one really loves me. No one really loves me. I just have to somehow hold it together enough to get by. Folks, God comes with the living Word Jesus to speak words of grace and truth to you today. The grace that God looks at you and looks favorably upon you. The truth that God has good things for you. And the question for you and I today is, will we trust what He's saying to us? Would you bow your heads with me?